everyone, this is Miss Wynn here with Tom's. Today in social studies we are going to look into the Enlightenment. Thank God, hallelujah, we are towards the end of the year. This is our last lesson. Today we're going to look at how the thinkers of the ancient world came to enlightenment. We talked about Mesopotamia, we've talked about the Aztecs, we've talked about the Incan. We've talked about how their technology influenced the entire world and how science helped them become better people, a better society. So today we're going to talk about the Age of Enlightenment. The Age of Enlightenment is when people start getting smarter. I mean, they were already smart, but they were not quite thinking for themselves. They were more so letting the government think for them. They were letting the kings rule them. So they decided to come up with different ideas about government power. And among them included John Locke, Charles Montesquieu, and JeanJacques Rousseau. They decided that we needed to put reason behind the science, and because of the science, we now have reason to say that maybe all the power doesn't come from the monarchy. Maybe it's time for us to think for ourselves. Maybe it's the rulers that are the ones that are causing some issues for our society, and maybe we should think for ourselves, and maybe that will make us better people. So they try to apply reason to society to help them better understand and make it better. Let me move on to my next slide here. Today we're talking about politics and government. This is where people start getting enlightened because of the philosophy that they've always learned. Because of that, they looked at absolutism, which is when the governments were ruling in Europe. It was through a king, through a queen, through rich people, through people who had money, like the Medici family that we learned about in Italy. Once this occurred, and philosophy came about, and science came about, and Socrates told us to question everything, everybody was enlightened. And that's what enlightened means, is they start thinking. People's brains kind of start waking up. So people started looking at absolute power and total absolute power in the hands of rulers and decided, we're not gonna do that anymore. A guy by the name of John Locke was a political philosopher. That means you're a philosopher like Socrates, Galileo, all those people that we've learned about. This guy, John Locke, is a political philosopher, which means he's a philosopher in government. There's different sections and it breaks down apart. Well, he stated that humans were born with natural rights. That means they're allowed to live the way they want to. They're allowed to live in the freedom that they're allowed to, however they want to. No government should infringe upon them. No government should interrupt what they're doing in their daily lives and tell them what to do. And everybody has a right to property, meaning owning things. If I live in my house, that's my property, and the government's not supposed to take that away from me. John Locke said that there should be a social contract. The government is supposed to be there to help the people, to protect the people. The government's not supposed to be there to rule the people and tell people what to do. The government's merely there just to protect those natural rights of the people: the life, the liberty, and property. They argue that if the government didn't protect these rights, then people can end up being ruled by the government, and that is not okay. So that means we need to create a new one. John Locke said that these ideas needed to be consented by the people, meaning the people who lived in that country should give that government the right to be able to rule over them. Not the other way around, where the king and the queen tell them what to do, but people should be able to tell the rulers how they want to be protected and how they are to how to engage in their natural rights, not the other way around. The government shouldn't tell them how to live, how to be free, and how to own property. It's the people that tell the government, listen, these are my rights, this is my life, this is my liberty, this is my property, and you tell me how that is to be protected, not the other way around. And that is true liberty. And that's where John Locke gave kind of the idea, and this is where the influence of Enlightenment started bouncing off into other countries. We talked about India, we talked about Brazil, we talked about Europe, and we talked about the Enlightenment influence in Europe in its entirety, and how people started thinking for themselves. This eventually was right around the time that America was beginning to form, and America, the 13 colonies, which we'll learn about next year, was enlightened at that time as well. Thomas Jefferson, it sparked an interest for America to eventually influence them to write the Declaration of Independence. That was written by Thomas Jefferson, and this Declaration of Independence basically said, we no longer are under the rule of England. We are independent, we are free, and we live in America. We have natural rights in this country, on this continent, and England has nothing to do with that. America started thinking for themselves. They were no longer slaves to the England trade. They were no longer doing the triangular trade, the Columbian trade that we talked about, and sending money back to England. They said, oh my God, we can make profit for ourselves. We can do this for ourselves. We have the supplies necessary. We can take care of each other, and we can be free. So this is where we'll talk about the American Revolution next year, and we'll talk about how this independence came about. But this is kind of where the spark starts, is with these Enlightenment philosophers. Another philosopher we talk about is JeanJacques Rousseau. And Rousseau is Genevan. He's from Switzerland. Switzerland is a little bit east of France, not Sweden, but right next to France. And JeanJacques Rousseau's viewpoint was a little different than John Locke's, but it's still within the same lane where we still want to talk about that freedom. He more focused on the government protecting the goodwill of the people, the general will or the common good of the people, and not just ruling over them. So it's similar to John Locke's, but he kind of went into a little more detail with it. He wants people to be able to say that the government makes policies, they make laws to benefit everybody, the good of the people, and not just it kind of narrows down into more so policies than anything. JeanJacques Rousseau quoted, whoever refuses to obey the general will be forced to do so by the entire body. This means merely that he will be forced to be free. So what he's basically saying is, if anybody refuses to obey, and if the entire body chooses to disobey, then that means that that entire body is free. They're no longer being ruled by that government. Another philosopher that we talked about in those readings also included Baron de Montesquieu. Now Montesquieu kind of gave a little format of how the government should be in check. And this is where we start talking about checks and balances. And what checks and balances is the branch and the separation of powers include the executive, the legislative, and the judicial branch. But these branches are able to check each other's powers to keep them balanced so that they don't overrule people. And that's the first step in being able to kind of control the government and limit the government so that they don't have absolute power anymore. Now, we talked about absolute power as the king or the queen completely ruling the entire country or the entire empire or whatever it is. Well, checks and balances keeps that king and queen in check. We talked about the Magna Carta. Remember when we said that the king signed the Magna Carta to say that he won't have rule over the people anymore. Well, that was kind of like the big snowball that started up on top of the hill and rolled into this big checks and balances down at the bottom of the hill to create the government, the snowball of the government that we have today. When we separate different powers, each part of the government, if you look on the PowerPoint, is separated into 3 different branches. The legislative branch creates those laws. The executive branch creates the enforcement, or they kind of put that law into play. And then the judicial branch makes sure that those laws are constitutional or are run or ran correctly. During this time, America was not created yet. So in England, the executive branch was that monarch. The legislative branch was the parliament, and the judicial branch were the courts. We talk about that in 8th grade a little bit later on, and we talk about how these branches are so important in checking each other in America, and also how it formed in England. His ideas, Baron Montesquieu's ideas, are still present in our government today. Today, our government, our legislative branch is the U.S. Capitol. We have the Congress, we have the Senate, and our executive branch is our White House. It's our president and our vice president. And then we have our judicial courts, our Supreme Court. They run our judicial branch. So these ideas still hold today, and it's because of this Enlightenment. People were starting to think for themselves and saying, hey, how can we keep the king's power in check? Because before this, it was chaos. We've talked about Bonaparte and how he tried to conquer lands. We're way past Egypt. We're way past pharaohs. We're way past Alexander the Great. Although some of those governments we still see today, this is more of how we keep the powers in check so that they don't overpower us again. Let me go to my next slide. So taking a look at Voltaire, he is French. There's a lot of French people here. So Voltaire was also known as Francis Marie Ornette, and it's definitely a he. Like nice fluffy hair there, but he focused on civil liberties, and he was probably, I think, the most important of them all. He said that people had rights, just straight up rights, and the freedom of speech and the freedom of religion was the most important of these, and we must not infringe upon them. We have to defend them. He said, I disapprove of what you say, but we'll defend it to death. We'll defend to death your right to say it. Sometimes we know that online and in stories and in news that we've watched throughout the school year, some of it's biased, some of it's opinionated, and we've talked about that. But these are civil liberties. It's a double-edged sword, meaning there's some good things that happen to it, but you also have to have the bad things that happen as well. Some of these make sense, and some of these don't. It's up to us, the enlightened ones, to make the decision of whether or not we agree with it, and we run with it, or we don't. This is what we call social reform. During this Enlightenment, it was social reform because a lot of people started thinking for themselves, which made the society a lot better because the society, the people, started thinking for themselves, and they didn't just let the king rule them.